Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome to another episode of AI and the Future of Work, the weekly podcast where we discuss the future of work with entrepreneurs, technologists, venture capitalists, and journalists. This is your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of Insight Finder, the AI-first system of intelligence for IT operations, and the executive chairman of PeopleRain, a leading platform for automating IT and HR employee service. Today we're discussing a topic that has only come up a few times on the show and really deserves more attention. We talk a lot about natural language processing and various forms of AI typically associated with service bots. We discuss training data, algorithms, and how those algorithms are defining the future of work. Well, what lurks just behind the AI models is the infrastructure that supports those automated decisions. The servers, load balancers, databases, and all the configuration and code required to keep them healthy. DevOps is a term first coined in 2008 that, loosely speaking, popularized the development philosophy that if you write it, you own it. In the world of DevOps and its sibling, SRE or Site Reliability Engineering, operators are tasked with delivering infrastructure so reliable that it seems like it never has problems. Well, today's guest has made a career out of building the tools that are needed to achieve that appearance of secure, hands-free, self-healing infrastructure. In fact, being an SRE or a DevOps engineer is an incredibly hard job that requires support from a lot of different types of automation tools. And yet, increasingly, those automation tools make automated decisions using AI, of course. Well, today we're lucky to have Gareth Rushgrove, all the way from Cambridge, England, which, for those counting, it's about 8,600 kilometers from where I'm recording in Mountain View, California. Gareth has been publishing the widely read DevOps Weekly newsletter for an astounding 10 years. It's the definitive weekly guide to what's new and notable in the world of DevOps. I can tell you, I've done about 50 episodes of this podcast, and I can say confidently that this dude's an Iron Man. Gareth is currently at Sneak Security now, having done tours at Docker, Puppet, other places. He's one of the most recognized personalities in DevOps and also in the open source community. If you're not already, go follow him on Twitter. He's at Gareth R. You get lots of witty banter and open source geekery. With that said, Gareth, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about your background and maybe how you got into this space?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for the introduction. So I'm Gareth Rushgrove. I'm currently basically director of product at Sneak, as you mentioned, where I get up to all sorts of things. Before that, I was, working backwards, involved on the product side at Docker, involved on the engineering side at Puppet. And before I moved into sort of working for software vendors, I worked for the UK government and a bunch of different folks before then, mainly on sort of some in-house teams, startups. I guess I've done quite a variety of different things, mainly on the engineering side, mainly like being an engineer, writing software. Never really in like only one different language. I've written a whole bunch. But somewhere on the line, I ended up gravitating towards like sort of basically enabling tooling. I was the strange person who liked configuring CI systems back when it was like back before Jenkins. Even I ended up writing CI systems, which was never a good idea. I think that automation bits was sort of something it had been sort of part of my job at different times, and I just got more and more into it. When DevOps came along, I was working as an engineer and was basically the sort of dev to someone else's ops. I worked quite closely with a couple of system administrators. One of them happened to be at the first DevOps days, which sort of coined the term. And he came back and said, like, oh, you would have liked that. And I ended up getting involved from there. Alongside sort of work things, I guess I've been around open source communities for 20 years in different forms. Most recently, I guess, around the Kubernetes community and in particular the Open Policy Agent project, where I'm a maintainer of one of the sub-projects now. It's a lot of open source work, and yeah, the DevOps Weekly newsletter, great fun. And I was in a really interesting place. Lots of us were talking about this thing that became DevOps, and I just started sending a newsletter. One thing I would say is though, never put weekly in the title of anything.
Made that mistake. Gareth, we're glad that someone was excited about CI/CD way back when. We all owe you a debt of gratitude.
I mean, I think I was definitely like learning from other people who were there before me. There's a number of people I learned from in that sort of early CI space. But yeah, I will have a think. There's definitely some references we should have mentioned, like SitCon and a few other things. With sort of really, I guess, around that time, sort of people were talking about before DevOps was a thing.
I too was at the first DevOps days, and gosh, talk about a trip down memory lane. Felt so raw. It was a small community, and it felt kind of fringe.
It was interesting also that it was around the same time that sort of Twitter came on the scene. And at that point, well, Twitter had like an open API you could do anything with. But also, one of the things I started doing was just following anyone who used the word DevOps. Like anyone who used that word, basically, it was a completely made up word. Anyone who used that word within the first year, it was a tiny group of people. And I've been lucky enough to meet a lot of those people, work with quite a lot of them since as well. And it's still a really interesting sort of community to be around.
I remember first meeting John Allspaw, who's the CTO of Etsy, and just being inspired that anyone could be so passionate about the world of operations. It seemed like all the glory went to the developers, but he kind of shifted my thinking.
Yeah, definitely an influence on a lot of people.
I'm interested in the shift that you made from more kind of traditional DevOps and infrastructure management to security at Snyk. Maybe talk us through why what Snyk does is important.
Yeah, certainly. I guess I've constantly been shifting in different ways. As I sort of started out working on software roles, but in different types of organizations. I worked in like small sort of like 2-3 people type companies. I also worked for a big radio conglomerate in the UK. I worked for startups. I worked for the UK government. I ended up doing sort of, I guess, straight software jobs and software operations hybrid jobs later as I got more interested in DevOps. I was involved in like sort of building out cloud infrastructure and that sort of a lot of automation in different places. While I was working for the government, I actually did quite a bit of sort of more architecture work. I also did quite a bit of security work, and sort of it was something that was interesting to me before, but I did quite a lot of work there that sort of made it a bit more of a passion. I've also then gone through like mainly working on sort of as a individual contributor engineer, and then into product roles. I guess I've always liked lots of things. I enjoy both like the deeply technical, but also the sort of business side. So product as part of that, but also I think security is this really interesting, like sort of socio-technical system problem. And yeah, so at Snyk, I'm responsible for one of our groups building products, mainly around container security, and actually most recently around looking at infrastructure and configuration security.
I love that word that you use, socio-technical. So talk to us about the socio end of the socio-technical set of problems that security introduces. What's kind of the either the value add of Snyk or your perspective on the importance of kind of having a strong security posture?
Yeah, I think they're related. I think security has always been something, IT security has always been there, but to a degree, it's always been sort of relegated to a subset of the IT space, and software development and developers often look down on IT for bad reasons. But the reality is a lot of the software people have built over the last 20 years just isn't secure. It's like we've not always known how to build secure software, but also we've often chosen not to build secure software because we just didn't care enough, or because it was hard, or because it was expensive or time consuming, or all of those things. The reality now is that's come back to bite us. Like, whether it's companies, governments, everyone is getting compromised in some way, and that's resulting in lots of lost money and news stories in the news every day. To the extent that that's now a boardroom problem, that's now a regulation problem, and so I think with that is coming a lot of pressure to make this better. That sort of existential threat of like the security problem that brings down your business, like is there and is real, and it's not just a sort of boogeyman story. But at the same time, as in most cases, if you say, well, you can go fast, or you can be secure, and that's generally been the story. The security people have said, oh no, you'll need to slow down massively in order to become secure. Businesses ultimately say, well, security might kill you, but not going fast will kill me. So, okay, we'll not do that secure thing. I think if you have it, I think what we're seeing now, though, is a better understanding of not separating these things out, not reasoning about them separately, not having just wholly security as someone else's problem somewhere in the organization. You bring the people together, and you bring tools that facilitate them working together, and you can have sort of secure systems, and you can move fast at the same time. And Snyk was founded by a good friend of mine, Guy Pajani, nearly 5 years ago now, and really around that hypothesis that building ultimately developer tools that were also security tools would allow organizations to go fast and remain secure. And really, that's what we've been doing, is building out developer first security tools. And it's really now sort of, I guess, what was at that time just a sort of very much as something that other people were not considering is now becoming clear that that's the right approach. You see the research done in the DevOps report and others really sort of with hard evidence that collaboration is fundamental, and tools that facilitate collaboration help. And yeah, we're trying to build those and really sort of bridge some of those historical boundaries between security and development teams.
So speaking of that trade-off between, I like the way you put it, kind of going fast versus being secure, I think there's certainly parallels with DevOps. What do you think the enduring contribution of DevOps as a development pattern is on overall software development?
Oh, good question. So to me, I think it was, so stepping back, I think the question of what is DevOps to different people. For me, it was ultimately, and still is, it's a banner under which a bunch of conversations can happen. It's marketing in the best possible way, which upsets some people. But I viewed through that lens, I think the biggest contribution is ultimately where that conversation works. It's not just about technology. I love geeking out about technology as well, and I think engineers naturally will do so. But I think DevOps is ultimately put in a position where it's not enough to just talk about technology. And I think that's having a wider impact than people think. Yes, people will still talk about software vendors and just talking about tools. Yes, people will simplify DevOps to just a developer and operator working together and some technology. But actually, I would say stepping back 10 years ago and to now, there's just a lot more conversations about the sort of, again, those not separate conversations about people and separate conversations about technology, but we're having them together, and it's the same people. It's no longer that you just need to be on the IC track and you're interested in tools, or the management track and you're interested in people. It's much more nuanced. And I think DevOps has been it's not the instigator, but it was the it was the banner, it was the place a bunch of those conversations really got going. So I think that will be it. It will be we're better placed to have conversations about like the people and the tech tools and technology side together versus separately.
Well said. Back to kind of the socio and the technical combined. I think you're right. It spawned a bunch of conversations in the community that might not have happened otherwise. Now, I know you're very involved in the open source community, in the Kubernetes community. I'm curious to get your feedback. Where is containerization, container management, where is it headed in the next, say, 2 to 3 years?
I think the sort of tourism that people are surprised by how far things move in like sort of a longer, like a 10-year period, and disappointed by how far things move in like a year or two is going to be true there. I think that 2 or 3 years, ultimately, what we'll probably see is really just refinements of what we have now at a grand scale. There'll be lots of interesting new tools and there'll be lots of improvements. I mean, that's several generations of Kubernetes and we see that moving quite quickly. But that's in the details. And for the most part, if you look 2 years back at Kubernetes, it's doing the same thing. And it's doing it better today. There's a lot there. There's a lot being added. But it's about the hard work, not about the big picture. So I think actually in 2 or 3 years, at a high level, we won't see those big changes. Just because technology moves in some ways a lot slower than we think it does, at the same time as it moves faster than we sort of can always like keep up. I definitely think there's a growing conversation around applications. I would say this though, and I've probably been saying this for, I think the first KubeCon in Europe, I did a talk about this. So I'm biased and I still think it's going to happen. I think there are other people who've been banging this drum for as long. But I think we're starting to get to the point where the thing that drew some of us in, who were more application people, to Kubernetes, you're starting to see all the primitives actually in place and the potential for those things to happen now. So I think there's more to people building the next set of tools on top of Kubernetes around applications. So, and there's experiments there, like the Rio stuff from Rancher, the Knative parts as well around the Knative project, Tilt as a sort of interesting developer-focused tool. Some of the work that the VMware have been doing with like KApp and the sort of composable tool chain. I think that will continue, and I'd like to say maybe in 2 or 3 years there'll be a few of those or one of those that's really sort of becoming something that people recommend as a starting point, like for application-centric views on Kubernetes. Kubernetes is still viewed really through the lens of infrastructure. Even primitives like deployment and certainly service are really infrastructural. There's been a long conversation about should Kubernetes have an application object, and I feel the answer is inevitably yes at some point, but agreeing on what that should be, we need a lot more to happen outside Kubernetes before we sort of make something the de facto standard. So yeah, more application centric view of containers and Kubernetes, I think, is definitely something I'd like to see, and I think is like we are seeing things moving there.
So speaking of kind of new initiatives that are gaining momentum, I know you've been active with the Open Policy Agent. Maybe describe why it exists and what your involvement has been.
Yeah, definitely an interesting project. So Open Policy Agent fundamentally, and again, how I think about it is, it's sort of what it's described. It's an open source project, and it's providing a policy engine. And really that comes down to 2 parts. There's a policy language called Rego. Basically, it's a logic programming language. It's a domain-specific language, really just for describing logical rules against structured data. And the agent part is it's an execution engine for that language. So basically you feed in structured data, you feed in policies, and it outputs like decisions based on those. So it's a low level component, and you can run it as a service, you can use it as a library. And if you think about it, you'll have written policy engines, if you've been writing code for a while, multiple times. Some sort of like something that took in some data, that made a decision and output something. Open policy is really saying like, well, each time you did that, well, could we build a generic version of that has able to do very fast like processing, and has just like avoids a bunch of heavy lifting that you probably never got around to doing. And what I found interesting about it is the applications for something like that are really broad, and also the fact that it has its own language is a barrier to entry. But if that language is useful for lots of different use cases, suddenly that raises the barrier to entry. It's not just that it's a policy in a language that's useful for Kubernetes, it's useful for other things too. And I'm a bit of a DSL nerd, so I like method languages. I like logic programming. So it sort of was designed for me in some ways. But I do think the properties of it are interesting to see it sort of like grow. And a lot of the initial use cases were around Kubernetes. So you saw it, and you still do see it really actively used for admission controllers in Kubernetes. But you're also seeing it integrated by other projects. So Istio has sort of built-in thing there. Ceph, there's lots of projects have started integrating it. Some related to Kubernetes and others totally unrelated. I got involved, I'm going to say 2 and a bit years ago or so. The project had been around for a little while. I was super interested in it. I hadn't had enough time to hack around on it. But what I wanted was a developer interface really to that. I wanted to be able to use it outside, not as a service, but as a command line tool. And I wanted to be able to use it in CI systems. And I wanted to be able to use it for any arbitrary configuration, not just Kubernetes. And so I set about building something and integrating it as a library into what became a conf test. Conf test is a CLI tool that does all those things. So basically, point it at a config file, point it at some policy, and it will give you a result. And we made that really easy to integrate into CI systems, and we have a bunch of plugins. I hacked on that for a little bit, then publicly announced it and open sourced it at KubeCon in Barcelona, going back over a year ago. And yeah, then a whole bunch of other people sort of said, I have that problem as well. We built a small team of maintainers, again, just like in open source sort of capacity, totally asynchronous, and we've added now support for, I'd added Open Policy Agent supported JSON, and so I'd made conf test work with YAML and JSON. Since then, we've added, let's think, Vue and HCL from Terraform, and XML, TOML, EDN. I think there's a list of now sort of 15 or so different configuration formats. Varnish configuration, VCL. Any of these sort of configuration formats that can be ultimately serialized to a data structure, we have a plugin model that does that, and then you write Rego policies against any of those. And yeah, then you benefit from the ability to run it locally, run it as part of your IDE, run it in CI/CD systems, run it sort of early in the development process. And yeah, that's been really popular. I'm both for sort of, again, around the Kubernetes community, but also there's been quite a lot of interest most recently with Terraform. So people writing tests for their Terraform code. This didn't invent the idea of writing tests for infrastructure as code. I think that goes back to some of the work that was done on Chef Spec and Puppet RSpec with Tim Sharp, who was at GitHub at the time. And there's probably some less popular tools before then, but they were the ones that really sort of caught on in those ecosystems. But I've always wanted that for anything. And given the sort of move towards structured data as configuration, Contest is that tool. It allows you to write tests against arbitrary config.
And we've been talking about kind of the future of software and maybe even the future of DevOps. There's some segment of the community that envisions DevOps moving to no ops, which I'll editorialize a little bit. Seems a bit naive, and it trivializes the hard work that goes into maintaining secure, scalable infrastructure. My editorial aside, would love to get your feedback. Is that something that even in some version of the world will exist? No ops as an extension of DevOps?
I think ultimately the term came from, I think how the term was presented originally and sort of postulated was certainly naive and a bit rude. So I don't think as a term it will stick, apart from to sort of as a sort of counterpoint to a conversation like this. I think some of it comes down to a misunderstanding of what operations is. Operations will never go away. Operations isn't just systems administration, which is a big enough domain in itself. It's like, you have operations in sales, you have operations in ultimately it's the art of how we run things, and that's never going away. Well, like in any way, in any real sense, it will evolve and change in the same way as systems administration has done. And you can talk about sort of, and you mentioned SRE earlier. Like, I would postulate that these are just evolutions. They're just like, and we change names sometimes as part of evolutions, and sometimes we don't. So you hear people using the term systems administration less today, but you hear them using SRE more. Is this the same thing? I would say yes, basically. On the other hand, I would say, well, no, it's not. There's an evolution here, but words are interesting because you can argue the semantics off of them. In that sense, operations never goes away. There is always a need for something running something, and so the idea of there being no operations just is nonsensical. The idea that operators in the future will work differently to operators today, I don't think anyone would disagree with a statement like that. But yeah, the idea that there'll be no operations or no people, I think that's a sort of not a step. And again, like even if software is doing what we do today, well, we call it automation. If AI is doing some of that tomorrow, like we're still really we taught computers to do jobs we did before, but operations are still happening.
So we're about out of time, but I gotta make sure we have time for this one last question. I mentioned I see you as the Iron Man, 10 years, incredible feat. Talk us through kind of the initial vision. I like how you put it. You made the mistake of putting weekly in the title, but kind of the initial vision and maybe the top lesson you've learned from publishing the DevOps Weekly newsletter over the years.
I mean, I don't think there was a vision as much as I was interested. And again, there was I was doing things with sort of automation tools. I'd been doing sort of things with developer tools for a while. I was working closely with some people who were on the operations side and learning a whole bunch. The word DevOps came up, started some of those conversations on the internet, went along to the Hamburg DevOps days, and yeah, I guess I found my crowd a little bit. And Ruby Weekly had sort of Peter started sending that a little bit before, and I was like, yeah, why not do that? I'll just send an email with a bunch of things. Signed up a bunch of people, started sending it. It wasn't weekly to start with, though the title said it was, because I didn't have the I just sent it when I could, but I was finding stuff and it was going out occasionally and people were liking it. And yeah, I'm just stubborn, and I guess also I kept learning. I kept finding things. At times that's me looking for things. At times that's people sending me things. And that's been a really virtuous circle. And yeah, I think one of the, to a degree, it's, someone said, oh, you must put in lots of time to research. And I go, not really. It's an output of the things I would do anyway. And I think that's maybe something to take away is like, from, if you want to do something that does last, doing it like regularly does actually help. Putting weekly in the title forces you into something that is quite potentially a terrible idea, but that routine builds habit, and habit becomes relatively easy to do, even if other people are like, wow, how do you even do that? The other thing is follow what interests you. DevOps Weekly has definitely evolved. Like if you look at partly alongside conversations around DevOps, security being a good example. The first sort of bunch of DevOps people, we didn't talk about security much. It just wasn't the topic. It then became one after a year or two, as like more people joined, as the community sort of evolved. The things I'm interested in today are different. They're evolving all the time. Because DevOps is that broad banner, like other people are doing so as well, and like I can still talk about and promote and research the things that interest me under that banner. Some people hate that flexibility because they want it to be in a box, and I like that flexibility. So I think like finding flexible banners and communities, doing things regularly, and yeah, follow things that interest you. I think DevOps Weekly probably has lasted 10 years because of the confluence of all those things.
And for listeners who, for some crazy reason, aren't yet signed up for it, where can they register?
Oh, DevOpsWeekly.com. That's our sign up page.
Had to make sure we got in a plug for it. Good. Hey, Gareth, unfortunately, we're about out of time. It feels like we're just getting started. There's certainly more versions of this, and maybe as that future of DevOps that we discussed comes to fruition, maybe we'll have you back for another episode. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great. Good. Always good to chat.
This has been brilliant. It's so good having Gareth on the show. I know I learned a lot. Again, if you're not already, subscribe to Gareth's newsletter. Go to devopsweekly.com. If you're not already following Gareth on Twitter @GarethR. That's going to wrap us up for this week of AI and the Future of Work. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, back next week with another fascinating guest.